Why don't you tell us a little bit about your travel, more of your missionary travel and some of your other travel that you've done recently.
You mentioned about those church history and American history
Yeah.
in Canada, Alaska.
But the meeting some of the other missionaries, one thing that I thought was real special and it's kind of significant was when I met Joe in Lima, and we traveled pretty well around South America. We went to most of the countries, over to Brazil, and in Brazil, Joe talked to the cab driver, and well, another thing just about that too, the cab driver's part was a lot longer than the flight. We flew from Buenos Aires to Sao Paulo, and it took us twice as long to get from the airport in Sao Paulo to downtown Sao Paulo as it did to fly from Buenos Aires to the airport. And it's a big country and a big airport and a big area. And Joe talked to the cab driver about the difference between Spanish and Portuguese. And then when we got to the hotel, he talked to the bellhop and the elevator boy, and then when we were eating lunch, he talked to the one that was helping us there. And just within a few hours, Joe was pretty able to communicate in Portuguese. It was that close, and he was just working with these people. But the thing I was going to mention is we got through with South America, and we, of course, didn't give it a thorough, but we had a good taste and a good tour of most of the countries in South America, and went out to Otavalo in Ecuador, and we went then down to Mexico and went out to Merida, and then went out to Piste, where Joe had lived as a young fellow with the Blairs when they were there in Mexico. Well, it was during the summer, and he got quite well acquainted with the young people. He was just a young boy then.
How many years later was this when you and Joe?
I think it was 9 years later. So he was about 10 or 11 or 12, I guess maybe 12 years old when he was there. And as we got off the bus, we took the bus from Merida to Piste, and that's kind of the center place of the Mayans, and that's where Bob and Julia and Joe and kids were. As we got off the bus, Joe was telling me he sure was anxious to go back and see some of his friends in Piste and Chichen Itza and those places. And these little beautiful Mayans, their heads were popping out, seeing who was getting off the bus. And I heard and it just rang like a bell almost. Jose is returned. Jose has come back. And they just gathered around, and before long, Joe says, my friend here, he's married, has his little home, and has a wife, and has a baby, and he's invited us to come over and see his place. And we went through the bush and the brush, and he had built a little home himself out in the brush, and there his wife was with the little baby, and it was a real special experience, and one that wouldn't have had except that this young fellow was a friend of Joe's when he was there, and now he was married and had a wife and wanted Joe to come and meet them. Well, that was a real interesting meeting of Joe in Peru at the end of his mission. And the home that he was living in was the mission home. He was the counselor and the mission president.
In Lima, you're speaking of now.
In Lima. And when he went back to Lima, these 15 years later, whenever it was, that he went back to reside, he lived in that same home. And when Mama and I were there visiting them this last year, we were in that same home in Lima. Why don't you tell about the trip to Lima and to South America this last time when Joe and Jennie were there with their family?
That was really such a thrill from beginning to end. To see Joe and Jennie, and we went with them and their children, hundreds and hundreds of miles. They were touring the mission, which they did very frequently. But at every place, they were given such a wonderful reception. The people just loved them. Jennie was really as fluent as Joe in Spanish. Of course, they're quadlinguals. After he graduated from his law school, they went up into Canada just for vacation, and to Quebec, and learned French. And were just pretty fluent in it. So when he practiced law in Denver for a while, his French came in very handy. They had him on some of the big cases where they needed a French interpreter. But that's from the law perspective. But we were certainly given a royal treatment, and it was just wonderful to see the saints and to feel we share completely the love and admiration and understanding that Joe and Jennie have for these people. They're different than we are, but they got right to the heart, and they just really, really were great with those. And with the missionaries, we had privilege, they frequently had, after the meeting, they'd have testimony period, and that was great, and he once in a while asked us to speak, and Joe had a special warm place in his heart. We should have him tell it. For some of these who really have nothing in the way of material things, kind, sweet, intelligent people that never really had an opportunity. He wanted to show us some of the smaller branches. Now in Lima, and close by, their chapels and everything was very similar to ours. That was for the upper crust. But he wanted to show us some of these others where they didn't have these material things. And he drove us one Sunday morning to a little branch, just held him on the members' homes. And we couldn't understand too much of the Sunday school lesson that was being given when we arrived. We understood enough that I said, that's I've never ever heard of that. Dirt floors, and just the chairs and things that try to make benches out of. But they were just so excited about being converts to the true church and just telling about it. Now, let me just tell this one experience. This was rather typical. It took a long time to go from Lima all over the mission, 2 or 3 days. And this one place we stopped at, Joe said, now tomorrow we're going to go to a certain, I can't think of the name of that area. I couldn't pronounce it. And visit them. But we have no way of communicating. They didn't have mail service, they didn't have phones. But he said, we're going to go, and try to arrive there in time. We're trying to, they were just completing their ranch organization, weren't they?
Yeah.
But he said, we're going to go there. It's quite a surprise for them. So we all drove. It was, a couple of hours that we used to drive. And when we arrived, the branch president and his counselor were out in front waiting for us. The branch president said on Friday night he went to sleep and he called it a Spanish outbreak, sort of a dream. And that President Groberg, Joe, and his wife were going to come this next Sunday morning. And he was bringing with him, he said, I can't tell quite who it is. It's not exactly a general authority, but it's kind of an important man in the church. And when he found out that Grandpa had been a temple person, he thought that was it. So he got busy, and they went around to all the areas that went to that ranch, and to be sure they all knew would be there, even if it was quite an effort to make it. So when we arrived, they were ready to welcome us without anything but just that spiritual experience we had. You know, it was so packed we couldn't even. Of course, again, it was in a member's home, but well, they weren't. It was a mining community, and this was really quite natural. But we got on and moved, and that was, you know, an amazing thing. It didn't seem amazing then, though. I mean, things like that happened so much. When I think of that wonderful young bishop that came in to meet Joe, talk about some business, and he'd been a member. He was made a bishop, but he'd been a member 1 year. Was that right?
So
We talked to him. Joe says, "You just got to come and meet this young bishop." And we didn't know how we were going to communicate, so through Joe. And I would say, I wish I could speak Spanish. And I thought he'd say, I wish I could speak English. But he didn't. He said, it doesn't matter. He says, we both have testimonies of the true church, and we communicate with the Spirit. We don't need to speak each other's language. No, but it was really great. And that missionary, just before we left, which wasn't too much longer, Bishop, asked us to come to his bar. Now this was in Lehman, really fine chapel and everything. But during that month, they had baptized 50 members in their area, area. And they were having a great big welcome, these new members. They had drama, they had everything to perfection. You think that's all they had to do.
it was just an honor program for the new members that month.
50 of them had been baptized. They were. But Joe and Jennie are the ones that can really tell. We really loved those people as we did all the mission visits.
What did you tell about picking up Lewis?
Yeah, let me just comment about something else that we did last year in South America, and it was kind of a highlight. We borrowed Anna to be an interpreter, and we went to Ecuador and went out to Otavalo, and it had a real meaning to us because when I met Joe at the close of his mission, we went out to Otavalo and saw those beautiful natives that had never been Europeanized or had never learned Spanish or had never been spoiled by any of the influences except that is, they just had their own influence, and that was working, having their little farms, taking care of crafts and making things, and going into the cities and selling them, and then going back to their place, and they had their schools and their meetings, their communication, just almost like they had for centuries, and they were so beautiful. And I wrote a letter to President Kimball. He was a member of the 12.
Now this is when he was there before.
When Joe and I were there, and said that we met some people down in Otavalo that just didn't have any changing to make at all to be members of the church. They hadn't been taught to be dependent on anyone. They hadn't been proselyted into Spanish customs or faith or anything. And they were just beautiful, and they were real Lamanites. They were really pure. And President Kimball wrote me a letter back and says, I'm going down to South America and I'll take your letter with me. And then he wrote again and said, we went over to Otavalo and we have sent some missionaries over there. Well, we were just interested. We'd heard a few reports, but we were really interested to see what had happened. And they had organized a stake there in Otavalo.
Lamanite, all Lamanite.
Yeah, it was all Lamanite stake, and we visited with the stake president and with some of the members there, and Anna really interpreted for us, and we communicated very well. And
13.
and we really, that was a highlight of getting to Otavalo to see what had happened from the time we sort of discovered them. And then just a few years here they were with wards and stake organization and all native. And we went out to Brother Tobango's place. Brother Tobango was a good friend of President Kimball. He was one of the first ones that he met, and he had pictures all over his walls of meeting with the brethren, with President Kimball and with President Tanner and with others. And his son and his family were there, and we took some pictures. And last conference, Jennie and I at the temple grounds, or the tabernacle grounds here, saw one of the boys who was going to the BYU now. He was one that we met there at his father's place in Otavalo. The reason we can tell him was that where his hair in a braid down his back, and it had a little friction or a little sensitive deal. He didn't quite meet the hair grooming standards at BYU, but when they talked it over, why they decided it was perfectly all right, because that's the custom in Otavalo. That's the way they have their hair, and the braid down the back. And we didn't recognize him as being this Tobango boy at first. We just recognized him as being from Otavalo. But we said, are you one of the stake presidency? And he says, no, I'm Tobango's son. You were there to our place in Otavalo. Well, that's just a little chapter.
These people, let me just mention, you'd have to go to believe this, but they were these Otavalo Indians, they're so clean. The men all wear white pants. And you never see a spot on them. They just wash them, bring and wash them in on the cold water in the night. And their farms and their gardens, it's like you're walking into a fairyland. They have the mountainous. They have all terrace and gardens and vegetables. And you never see any, weeds or things out of order. We were just like, when Grandpa first returned from bringing Joe, and Grandpa Joe returned, after we said hello, Grandpa says, I must tell you about Otavalo. And he started crying. That wasn't quite like Grandpa, He's been so touched by this first visit. So I understood really what he experienced at that first visit. You see, it was a privilege. He took me back for my birthday. Was that right?
That's right. We were there on Mama's birthday.
But before we leave the missionaries, you must mention our wonderful Dick and his. And let me just say that when I went over to, I'll make it brief, I know we're too long, to meet Mary Jane. I met her in Ireland, and several of those people too. There was a beautiful little Irish lady she'd been teaching the gospel to. And I'm quite sure this is the one. I'll just be quick about it. Now, she and her companion had been out. They used to tract and they were just ready to give up. They knocked on every door. And it was time to go home. Mary said, no, we're going to go to that last guy there. And when they knocked, this little lady said, well, I've been waiting, what did she say, 4 years for the missionaries to come back. Somebody left the mission in here. But I haven't known where to go or what to do about it. It was quite a beautiful experience. A beautiful little lady, but she was baptized the night before, as I recall, Mary and I. But after that baptism, the district president, the elder in charge, there were quite a group of us baptism. He asked me if he could speak to me privately for a minute, and I said, oh my. And so he took me into his office, and he's alone. And he said, I couldn't say this in front of all those elders. So I want you as Mary's mother to know that your daughter is the most effective missionary we have in this district. And then he told why and how she, are complete and the beautiful relations and testimony. He says, I don't want to tell that in front of the elders. It was like a lady missionary. Learned that, and then noticing how Anna was so wonderful and taking us under her wing all over Ecuador. When I went around with Mary, I just marveled every day the way she could get around all these. We went to France and several of those countries, but she could get to a subway, train, any place, and I'd just trail along trying to keep up with her. It was like she was the mother and I was the little daughter. I just marveled at it.
Yeah, you mentioned about Dick. I sent Mama a telegram when she was in Sweden, I think, that we had a mission call and come for Dick to go to Helsinki, the Finland mission, and if she could, she ought to go over to Helsinki anyway and see that part of Finland. So they made arrangements and they went over to Helsinki. And then when Dick's mission was over, I flew to Helsinki, and the mission president there said that Dick and the group had gone over to Russia. They'd been released, and that they had just taken the train and gone to Russia. And I went down to the train to meet them when they came out. And it was a kind of a scary feeling. I had some concern about whether they'd come back or not on the train. But they had gone over just on a little tour into Russia. It's so close there. And then Dick and I, and this was midwinter, and it was just as cold as they say it is in Finland. And we went out into the country area where Dick had been working, and we had on real heavy coats and Finnish caps and gloves and boots. And
you have to mention about the hat, how this big hat, they pull it onto the side over one ear, let this ear freeze. And then when they can't stand it any longer, they shift it. That's the way they wear them. Dad still wears it.
Yeah, I've got a good hat. But we visited in Finland. We went to a little store there in Helsinki where the runner, can't say his name now, they had a great big Olympic stadium there in honor of him. He had won the fastest runner, numero, let's see.
Well, I think so, man.
Well, anyway, he had a little haberdashery shop, and we bought some ties and some things in his shop and visited with him. And then we went from there, and this was kind of a sad note. we went to the airport when we got through visiting in Finland, and the announcer at the airport announced the arrival of the plane in English, in Swedish, and in German. And Dick said, and in French. And Dick says, we haven't even got out of the airport and they've stopped speaking Finnish. They didn't make it. They announced it in Swedish and in English and in French and in German.
But tell how fluent Dick became in about one day with Swedish.
Well, there's a bilingual situation in Finland, and so they have Swedish there too, and Dick was very capable of it. As we got into Sweden, we visited our families. One of my father's cousins was there, met us as we went out to a little place called Groberg, and we had written him, and he was down with a little sleigh, put our bags on the sleigh, and then walked up to his home, and he remembered grandmother. He was grandmother's nephew. His father and grandmother were brother and sister. And father had been there on a mission. He'd known father. He would be father's cousin. And Aunt Ellen had written back and forth. They were acquainted, and we've had many letters from them. And then when we went around the world and stopped in Sweden again when we were with Dee, we stopped there, and Jennie went out, and this Adolf and what was her name? Anna had just made a whole big batch of cookies, and when we came, we hadn't sent any word. We didn't know when we would get there. She said, I knew somebody was coming, so I baked some cookies, and we had...
All those Swedish, what do they call these real fancy little cake things?
And then we had another interesting thing. We got in touch with the missionaries and took them out to meet Adolf and Anna, and we wanted them to teach them and to really give them the lessons and an opportunity to understand the church. And the missionaries were really conscientious, and yet still they said, what good would it do way out here? There aren't any other members out here, and they wouldn't have any place to go. Any place to go to church. And as we talked to them, why, that was their policy, that they weren't doing missionary work way out in the areas where there weren't any members. They were doing it in the little cities and where they could have meetings and be with the saints. So our effort to get the missionaries out there didn't seem like it paid. But then with Dick, we went to Spain and to Italy and to the Netherlands and to England, and we had quite a trip. And then when we came home, we came from Portugal, and it was really a great big plane. We got on in Portugal, and it started for New York. And when it got out about 500 miles to the Azores, they announced they were going to land. And they landed there, and we all had to get out. Then when they got whatever they thought was necessary fixed, or found out what was wrong, they said, now we'll have to go back to Lisbon because we can't take off with enough gas to get to New York. And they had to take out a lot of gas to raise to get off the ground, so they went back to Portugal. And we were all curious about just what the trouble was. And as we sighted the airport in Lisbon, we could see just crowds and crowds of people there, just really, and the whole area just filled with people. And we thought, well, boy, they're just here waiting to pick us up when we crash. And we landed, and no people paid any attention to us, but they did direct us into a waiting area in the terminal. And I asked someone just what all the crowds were for, and it was that hijacked KLM. A KLM plane was coming in with the passengers of a hijacked ship that had been recovered, and they'd got the passengers off, and they were waiting for that plane to come in. And they fixed our plane all right, whatever it was, and gassed it up, and then we took off for New York. And when we were about 500 miles out of New York, the captain or the announcer said, "There's a big snowstorm in New York. We won't be able to land in New York. In a few minutes we'll get directions whether to land in Florida or in Montreal." Then in a little while he said, "We're going to land in Montreal." And we landed in Montreal, and they kept us there for 2 days. The airport was so snowed in New York. Finally we got down out of Montreal and to New York, and then got home. But that was quite an exciting.
We could go on for hours and hours giving these details. Why don't you take a couple minutes and tell about Lou, Dad? And then, of course,
Well, Lou is in the Philippines, and he was really anxious to have me come, and we kind of divided up so that it was going to be me to go down there, and then it was a concern about the South Pacific and the island area, whether there was conveniences or not. But I landed in Manila, and Lou was there to meet me, and the mission president, Brother Rose, and several of the missionaries. And we visited in Manila and met several of Lou's friends. And then we decided that there was a man by the name of Peter Grimm and his wife who were good friends of Lou. And we decided we'd like to meet him. Lou wanted me to meet him, and they said they thought he was over Singapore. So we went over to Singapore, and then we got to see that. It was quite interesting, but they said the Grimms had gone to this place where Jakarta, Indonesia.
oh, yeah.
So we went over to Jakarta, and there we found the friend on the plane that was from Jakarta, and he just took us over and had his man meet us in a car and take us to a hotel, and we had a big hotel at Jakarta. It had been governed by the Dutch for a long time, and then when they took it over from the Dutch, they didn't know how to maintain the big buildings that the Dutch had. But anyway, we wanted to find this Peter Grimm, and took us out to the Canadian Embassy, and there was a member of the church at the Canadian Embassy, and he says, "The Grimms are out in their yacht out in the harbor, and I'm going out there tonight." So Lou and I went out, and they met us in a little boat and took us out to the big yacht out in the harbor. And Peter Grimm told us his story about he had been commandeered by General MacArthur to take about 200,000 men that he had working for him in Stevedore, and they had this unloading business and put him in the army, and he was one of McCarthy's right-hand men during the war, and we really enjoyed meeting him and his wife, and then we've met his wife.
He's married a Mormon girl, and he had joined the church, making the field in the temple.
And he was one of the principal influences in getting the church going in Southeast Asia. And then Lou and I flew down to Australia, and then from Australia to New Zealand, and then from New Zealand to Tonga. And we were met at Tonga by John and the family, and we had a good time visiting Tonga. And then we came to Fiji, and then over to Samoa, and it was there that we left John and Jean and Manasseh now, and they were going to Nuatopatapu to dedicate the chapel. And
You've heard that.
they had a real experience, but we didn't know about it till after, because we left them there, and then we took a plane, come back to Hawaii, and then home.
Yeah, let's just very, very quickly mention, we haven't even mentioned David nor George. And of course, they were all great missionaries. David really was the only one that was called right to the United States, Southern States, and we used to get such fine letters from David. And I'll just quickly mention, when David returned, one of the first things, well, I guess we always did that, was they go back to the temple, and in those days, they often have the missionaries speak. They'd have a meeting, have them speak. And I remember when we were at Kilpack, David was just barely back, and President Kilpack asked David to come out and speak without any previous notice. And after the meeting, President Kilpack said to us, before we went through the session, David wasn't there. He says, you know, I felt when your son John spoke, there couldn't be a finer missionary report than he gave. But I think David, every bit as good. I can remember that he read more beautiful testimony. David maybe consider more, but let me mention that just before we came to Salt Lake this time, a couple of nights ago, we picked up the paper and noticed that James E. Coleman had died. You probably noticed that. And he was one of the visitors in Indonesia when George was there on his mission. And one of the most beautiful spiritual experiences that we ever recorded in our journals, and that was George was in charge of the branch. I can't remember the details. Brother Cullimore came, but there was a beautiful spiritual experience where George had taught the children to sing "I'm a Child of God" in Indonesian. And there were just, George would have to tell you the experience. Brother Cullimore was so touched by that, singing of these little children, these little Indonesian children, and by the testimony, the whole thing. George had written us how Brother Cullimore said he could hardly speak. The spirit was so strong in that meeting, after the little children sang, especially, stood up and just couldn't speak at all. And anyway, the next time we saw Brother Cullimore, we ran into him at a conference, and he just told us in detail about this and what a marvelous missionary George was. And George has some time to talk to him, tell you about that little experience. I recall that because of his death, just the other day. But we should mention that towards the end of his mission, the mission president was aware that in India, which is not open to proselyting, there was a Paul, somebody, we're kind of overstepping our bounds when we try to give their names. A man from India had joined the church.
His name was Paul, that's what we called him. But he had another name too.
Indian name. And he had gone back into Indonesia and had sort of taught the gospel.
But back in
And-
India.
Right. Oh my goodness, he baptized about 40 people. And so the mission president nearest was Indonesia there. And it was quite a concern. He didn't quite know what to do. There was no branch or anything, but anyway, I suppose he went through the authorities over him. They decided they'd better go organize a real investigate and see just what was going on, how much they did know, and it was sure a good thing they did. But anyway, they decided that George would be the one that could go there, and they would have to learn to speak enough Tamil, T-A-M-I-L. That's what they spoke in that area of India, and to communicate. So he chose George, and then he chose another Danielle, but that didn't quite work out. But in the meantime, we sort of got an SOS from George, you know, that not a word must be said about this. I don't know the details, but there was some concern because they're not really open. But of course, this man was from India and just telling his friends about it and so on. But I remember we just worked how long we worked on this phone call now because George needed to learn Tamil real fast. I remember I asked Bob and he said, "Mom, just calm down because he can't." Because it's one of the most difficult of all languages, dialects, you know. But anyway, finally we called big universities in the United States and got English or Tamil into English or English to Tamil, the other. And we went to BYU and had them copy the book. But you couldn't send the book in, but you could send pages that looked like letters. So George and his companion, Elder Arn, from the Spanish Fork. Oh, Hallam, Arn Hallam. So they went into India, and as a result, they organized 2 little branches, and they got some authority, priesthood authority, and some, whatever really needed to be done. But it was very, very challenging, difficult experience, you know. It was kind of an unfortunate part of India where people were, you know, really starving. But after George completed that part of his mission, he did come back home right from that area, went up to New Delhi and so on. His mission really was over then. But we had, less than a year ago, a man from that area, it's called Groberg, India. A young man come to Idaho Falls as a missionary, and we had him over to dinner, you know. Sure enough, he was from one of those families, and he was here, and his cousin, and he was in Idaho as a full-time missionary, and his cousin was in the MTC in Provo, and they have 6 branches there now, and he was telling us all about what had really developed. That was quite unique that he was from there. George really got something wonderful started there. You know.
Why don't you take a minute and tell us about your big China trip a few years ago to see Dee and his family.
You know, when we were released from the temple in August of 1980, people said, "What are you going to do?" And we said, "Well, we're going to visit our family, and that's going to be quite a visit," because the first thing was to go back to Washington, D.C., where Gloria was expecting a baby, and the day after we were released, Mama flew back and got there just in time for the birth, and I waited another day or so for some other things, and then went back, and then from Washington, D.C., we got some of our permits. We got a visa for Japan. We were going to go to Japan to see Dee, and we were going to stop at Seattle to see Beth and Barry, and we went to the Chinese embassy to try to get a visa for China, and all we got was delays, and they said maybe we could get it in Seattle, and when we got to Seattle, we couldn't get it there. They said maybe we'd get it in Tokyo. But we flew into Tokyo, and there Dee met us, and all of the general authorities were coming in that were invited and were connected. They were having the dedication of the Tokyo Temple and also a regional conference of the church. President Kimball was there, and President Tingey and President Benson, and we had a real interesting visit in Tokyo, and then we got it pretty all right, got our visa for China, and we flew from Tokyo over to Peking, and we didn't send the Blairs any word of when we were coming because we didn't have our visa, and as soon as we got our visa, we sent a cable to them saying that we would arrive in Peking on a certain flight and a certain date. And when we arrived there, no one was to meet us, no one was there. We watched.
We waited 4 hours.
We watched the airport thin out until we were about the only ones left, and we got on the phone and tried to call, and they were having holidays. And finally we did get in touch with Bob, and he gave us
2 days later.
Gave us the thing that happened. He says, we just got your message that a girl just got it and filed it.
She couldn't speak. She couldn't read English.
And
They were in the
so
conference,
the
so
first,
she just put the telegram with the other
first
mail.
they got it was 2 days later. And anyway, we really had a good visit and were well taken care of in Peking by just ourselves. That is, we got a taxi driver to take us to one of the big hotels where someone could speak English. One of the desk clerks or assistants there could speak English, and he arranged a room for us. And then on our own, we went out to the Forbidden City, and we went out to the Great Wall, and we saw things, and then we got a ride over to Jinan where they were, where the Blairs were, and they met us. And we had just a wonderful time in China, and we found the Blairs there just like they are here. Everybody just loved them and liked to go to their place, and just did everything to make our visit there pleasant.